On episode 00 of the Luke Who's Talking podcast, we're going to cover the who, what, when, and where of the podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the Luke Who's Talking podcast. So, in this episode, we're just going to cover a couple of things, finer details of the podcast. So, let's get into the who. Who is Luke? Well, that's me. I'm a 20-something-year-old living in a small area, or a regional Australian city, and I've got a great beard, so that's about as exciting as that gets. I'm a pretty unexciting person, but hopefully throughout the podcast, throughout its run, I might have some interesting stories for you and some interesting stories to tell. I haven't really gotten too personal there, have I? I'll give you a hint about where I live. I don't live on the big Australia. I'll tell you that. Some people might be a bit confused, thinking like, but I don't live on the big island. I'll give you that much for free. Let's get into the what of the podcast. What is the Luke Who's Talking podcast? Well, basically, it's just going to be me telling stories, elaborating and banging on about things I see around my day-to-day life, some things that are happening where I live, or just maybe some interesting news pieces that are happening and I might really just have an opinion or a rant about them. Maybe I should change this to Luke Who's Ranting. I'm just going to be telling some stories, elaborating on what I'm doing, what's happening in my day-to-day, what's happening where I'm living. There's possibility and scope there, I feel. When will the Luke Who's Talking podcast be released? At the moment, I'm thinking about doing a fortnightly schedule. I think so. I have enough sort of stories and things to talk about. I plan to have 3 stories per podcast, so I don't know how long it'll go for, maybe 5-10 minutes. I guess it really depends how long I'm rambling on for. So yeah, at this point, it's just going to be fortnightly. In the future, there most definitely will be scope to make that maybe weekly. I guess it really depends how much material I have, but as I say, at the moment, just really planning on it to be fortnightly. That is a schedule that I can stick to. I didn't want to say, yeah, it's going to be weekly and then do it weekly for a couple of weeks and be like, oh no, I don't have any material, I'm going to have to take it down. I think it's a bit more respectful for the listener for me to increase the frequency. Whoop. Cords going here everywhere. Increase the frequency of the podcast rather than reduce the frequency. I think that's just a bit fairer. I didn't want to be going, yeah, it's going to be weekly and then it not. So I think the fortnightly schedule is something that I can stick to, and I can, if I have a lot of stuff, I can get a few shows in the can, as it were, and set them up to be released. So I guess that's a bit of a warning. Everything I talk about might not have necessarily happened that particular week. It might have been something that happened 2, 3, 4 weeks ago. That's the when. I think I've covered that rather comprehensively. Now, the last thing is where. Where will you be able to listen to the Luke Who's Talking podcast? It's going to be on iTunes. That's a no-brainer. That is the biggest distributor of podcasts, so it'll be on iTunes. I will also look, of course, to get it on Stitcher and also in the future Spotify. That's, for if you're on Android, of course, you can't really get onto iTunes, so that's for you. We don't get Google Play, or is it called Google Music or whatever. Google don't have podcasts in Australia, unlike I believe in the United States you can get on Google Play Music and listen to podcasts. We don't have that luxury here in Australia, so Google, pick up your game, right? Just pick it up. It'll be on iTunes, Stitcher in the future, Spotify in the future. TuneIn, of course, is a possibility. I will also be looking to put it on YouTube. I'm actually just talking to a couple of my film friends at the moment to get some footage together, because if I have it on YouTube, I want a visual for you. I don't want it to be a black screen, a blank screen, or just a static image, because that's, even though I guess really you're not going to be looking at it and watching it, you're going to be listening, you deserve something to be there. So before I wrap things up here on the inaugural, I can't even say the word, the first episode, I just want to thank a couple of people, give a few people some shout outs and whatever. Now, I would like to thank, these people know who they are, so I'd like to thank Vixie and also Mrs. Angry Duck for their help on the artwork. I would also like to thank Tim for the name. I was floating some other options for names, and he said, hey, how about Luke Who's Talking? So thank you, Tim. And also, I'll give Bandrew Scott and the Podcastage community a shout out. The Podcastage server is it's just a great place. A lot of places on the internet are not very nice. That's a good place to be. And I'd just like to thank everybody on there, the Podcastage Discord server, for their help, their thoughts, I'll go as deep as saying support for this. For helping, not just me, they help everybody. It's a great place to be, so I might put a link for that in the description below. So I'd just like to thank everybody there. Now, before I wrap things up properly, I'd just like to say, where can you find us? So I'm on Twitter at @L_Who's Talking. You can also send in an email at lukewho'stalkingpod@gmail.com. What a mouthful that is. And you can also find us on Facebook at the Facebook page. I'll put links to these things down below if I remember. I should do, because I will listen to this back. So yeah, that's episode 00. Now, I did mention earlier, of course, I am going to do a fortnightly release. However, the first episode, 01, will be next week. So you won't have to wait the fortnight to get the first quote-unquote official episode of the podcast. So yeah, that's just the overview, the intro to the Luke Who's Talking podcast. I hope you'll listen. I was about to say like, comment, and subscribe. You don't say that on podcasts, do you? If you want to subscribe, you can. If you don't want to, I'm not going to force you. So don't bother. It's as simple as that. Anywho, I'll catch you next time, everybody. Bye.